There's a pull inside every man, I reckon, a whisper in the quiet moments that says there's got to be an easier way. A quicker path from here to where you truly want to be. We see the stories, don't we? The overnight successes, the folks who caught a lucky break, and a part of us, a hungry, impatient part, starts to believe that maybe, just maybe, hard work ain't always the answer. That digging in the dirt, day in and day out, is for suckers when there's a shining shortcut just around the bend, glittering like fool's gold. Most of us just wish on that star and keep on digging. But some men chase it. They run headlong after that glimmer, convinced they're smart enough, fast enough to outrun the natural order of things, to skip the tedious climb. And sometimes, the world's got a way of teaching those men a lesson they ain't never gonna forget. A lesson about roots, about the steady climb, and about how a fast fall can show you what was always true about building anything worthwhile. Earl was one of those men. Earl, 48 years old, a factory man through and through, spent his days wrestling steel on a line that hummed and clanged louder than a freight train. He moved with a practiced economy, each motion deliberate, born of 2 decades on the floor. His eyes, set deep in a face etched with the kind of lines you earn, carried the quiet wisdom of a man who'd seen too much of life's rougher edges. Not mean lines, mind you, but pathways carved by worry, by effort, and by a kind of stubborn, hard-won peace that settled on him like dust on an old workbench. The weariness was there, undeniable, a faint shadow under his eyes and a slight slump to his broad shoulders, a quiet testament to the heavy lifting of life. But beneath that fatigue, you could glimpse an inner stillness, a calm that spoke volumes about battles fought and lessons learned, a quiet dignity found only after weathering the storm. You could tell a lot about Earl just by looking at his hands. They were big, calloused, scarred in places where metal had bitten deep. The kind of hands that had built things, fixed things, provided for things. They weren't graceful hands, not soft executive hands, but workers' hands, honest hands, perpetually stained with grease and the faint scent of machined steel. They told a story of labor, of grit, of hours clocked and sweat earned. When he gripped a coffee cup, his knuckles were white not from tension, but from the sheer, unyielding strength beneath the skin. Each furrow, each scar, a chapter in a life lived by the clock, by the sweat of his brow. Earl wasn't a man who said much. He'd nod more than he'd speak, his gaze steady, observant, missing little. He listened, truly listened, which made his rare contributions to a conversation carry more weight than another man's sermon. There was a subtle smile that would sometimes play around his lips, a gentle crinkle at the corners of his tired eyes, usually when he was watching a younger fella bumble through a task he'd mastered years ago, or when someone cracked a joke that hit just right. It wasn't a boastful smile, just a knowing one, as if he understood more than he let on and had made peace with it. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who knew exactly who he was, and perhaps more importantly, who he wasn't anymore. A man shaped by the slow, steady turning of the world, and by the hard, unyielding lessons it had delivered. The alarm clock, a chipped plastic box from a forgotten era, screamed its 5 a.m. protest every weekday morning. Not a gentle chime, but a harsh, insistent buzz that scraped against the edges of Earl's sleep. He'd learned to move before it fully registered, a muscle memory developed over decades. A groan, low in his throat, was the only sound he allowed himself. The house was still dark, still quiet, a gentle hum of the refrigerator the only sign of life beyond his own. He'd swing his legs over the side of the bed, the cold floor a minor shock through worn slippers, and navigate the familiar path to the kitchen in the pre-dawn gloom. Coffee was the first ritual. Black, strong enough to stand a spoon in, brewed fresh in the percolator Sarah had given him for their 10th anniversary. While it dripped, gurgling its promises of wakefulness, he'd stare out the window, watching the streetlights cast long, fading shadows. A neighbor's porch light might flick on, then off. A distant truck's rumble would briefly pierce the silence. The world was stirring, slow and grudging, just like him. He'd eat a bowl of instant oatmeal, or maybe just a piece of toast, silently planning the day's production quotas in his head, the sequence of operations he'd oversee on the line. It was always the same. Another day in the factory, another shift spent coaxing metal into submission, another cycle of repetition and relentless noise. His job at the plant was steady, had been for nearly 30 years. He was a floor supervisor now, the kind of guy who knew every nut, bolt, and weld on every machine in his section. He knew the rhythm of the place, the groan of the old presses, the shriek of the grinders, the clatter of conveyor belts carrying unfinished parts. It was a symphony of industry, a loud, ceaseless roar that had long ago become the soundtrack to his life. He found a certain comfort in its predictability, the knowledge that each day would bring the same challenges, the same grind. Yet beneath that comfort, a dull ache persisted, a gnawing worry about the numbers. The bills piled up, neat stacks on the kitchen counter, each envelope a small punch to the gut. Mortgage, utilities, Emily's community college tuition, Michael's new basketball shoes, they were all just lines on a ledger, but they represented the weight of his world. Every dollar earned felt like a battle won, every dollar spent, a battle lost. He watched his wife, Sarah, stretching pennies, making meals out of leftovers, her own quiet sacrifices mirroring his. He saw the weariness in her eyes, too, and it felt like a mirror. Back in his younger days, Earl had burned with a different kind of fire. He'd been ambitious, impatient, always chasing the next big thing, the shortcut to a life beyond the factory floor. He'd seen the successful guys on TV, the ones with the flashy cars and the easy smiles, and he'd convinced himself that hard work was for suckers, a slow march to an ordinary grave, when there were faster routes to riches, shimmering paths paved with clever investments and groundbreaking ideas. He'd chased fads like a dog after a rabbit, pouring what little savings he had and what he could borrow into schemes that promised exponential returns. Dot-com bubbles, real estate flips, some bizarre investment in a South American coffee plantation that turned out to be a scam. He'd convinced himself he was smart, just ahead of the curve, seeing opportunities others missed. He was never a man to stand still, always pushing, always reaching. That Earl, the one with the restless eyes and the quick dreams, felt like a stranger now, a ghost from a past life he tried to keep buried deep. But that ghost still walked with him, casting a long shadow. Sometimes in the quiet of his commute or late at night when sleep refused to come, he'd find himself staring at his reflection in the dark window, seeing not the steady, dependable man he was today, but the reckless boy he used to be. He'd wonder, what if he hadn't been so impatient? What if he just stuck to the slow, steady path, saved diligently, invested cautiously, built brick by brick instead of trying to stack a skyscraper overnight? The gap between the ambitious young man with stars in his eyes and the weary factory worker with calloused hands was a chasm, filled with regret and the bitter taste of missed opportunities. He wanted to provide more for Sarah, for his kids, to give them a life free from the constant hum of financial worry that vibrated through their modest home. He wanted to be a hero, a provider of abundance. Instead, he felt like a caretaker of scarcity, always just barely keeping the wolf from the door. It was a quiet torment when he rarely, if ever, spoke aloud. The only solace was the silent strength he now carried, born from the very mistakes that had nearly broken him. The insistent buzz of the alarm clock, a cheap digital model he'd bought years ago, cut through the pre-dawn quiet like a dull knife. 5 a.m. every single weekday. Earl didn't need to look. His body knew the rhythm, the precise moment to swing his feet to the worn linoleum floor beside the bed. Sarah, nestled beside him, stirred faintly, a soft sigh escaping her lips. He brushed a stray strand of hair from her face, a silent promise to make things better someday, even if he didn't quite know how. A quick shower, the lukewarm water doing little to chase away the lingering fatigue, then down to the kitchen. The coffee pot was his first true companion of the day, its gurgling a familiar comfort in the otherwise silent house. While it brewed, he'd sit at the chipped formica table, running a thumb over the faint coffee ring stain that had been there for as long as he could remember. Emily would be up soon for community college, Michael not for another hour. But for these few minutes, it was just Earl and the quiet hum of the refrigerator. Sometimes he'd pick up a bill from the small stack on the counter, the one that seemed to grow faster than he could chip away at it. Electricity, mortgage, Emily's tuition, each envelope a small weight, a tangible reminder of the tightrope walk they performed every month. He'd stare at the numbers, his brow furrowed, doing the mental gymnastics of stretching paychecks, always just enough, but never quite enough to breathe easy. His work at the plant was the same as it had been for 25 years. A steady, mind-numbing ballet of steel and grease. The clang of machinery, the rhythmic thud of presses, the sharp smell of metal shavings and hydraulic fluid, it was all etched into his very being. He operated a machine that stamped out small, precision parts for engines. Day in, day out, the same motions, the same exact requirements for accuracy. His hands, gnarled and powerful, moved with unpracticed, almost unconscious grace, feeding sheets of metal, extracting the finished pieces, checking them against a template. It wasn't glorious work, not by a long shot. It paid the bills, though, just. During the monotonous hours, his mind, often against his will, would drift. He'd see the younger Earl, the one who'd scoffed at. Just a factory job. convinced he was destined for something grander. He'd remember the buzz of excitement, the intoxicating lure of a new opportunity, always pitched with such conviction, always promising a fast track out of this life, out of this town. It felt like a lifetime ago, yet the sting of those failures was as fresh as a new cut. The penny stocks that cratered, the real estate scheme that vanished, the internet bubble investment that burst like a cheap balloon. He'd poured his savings, his family's security, into those fleeting whispers of quick wealth, convinced he was too smart, too savvy to miss out. He'd lost it all, not just money, but a piece of his pride, his self-respect as a man who could provide. That ambition, once a blazing fire, now lay buried under years of steady, unglamorous effort, like embers hidden deep beneath ash. Sometimes a flicker would appear, a brief, dangerous thought. What if there's still a way? But he'd quickly extinguish it, a grim reminder of the cost of such reckless hope. He de-promised himself, promised Sarah, that he'd never chase another phantom. Never again gamble their future on a roll of the dice. Yet the ghost of those buried dreams still nagged at him, a quiet, insistent voice whispering about what might have been, about the life he'd envisioned for Emily and Michael, a life without the constant hum of financial worry, a life with more choices, more opportunities than he could give them now. He wanted to be the hero who lifted his family up, not the one who nearly dragged them down. He was a good man, he knew it, but he carried the heavy burden of a man who'd once believed himself to be smarter than patience, richer than steady growth. He knew the value of a dollar, all right, but only after learning the hard way how quickly it could vanish when chased with greedy hands and a restless heart. He hadn't just lost money. He'd lost time, precious years that could have been spent building, growing instead of chasing. He longed for the kind of security that felt rooted, like an old oak tree, not like a tumbleweed blown by every market gust. But the regret, that quiet, steady thrumming beneath his skin, was a constant companion, a silent witness to the path he'd chosen and the consequences he still lived with. He yearned to erase the past, to go back and tell that younger, arrogant Earl to slow down, to look around, to appreciate the quiet strength of steady effort. But there was no going back, only forward, one careful, deliberate step at a time. And even then, the shadow of his past self followed, a constant reminder of the price of impatience. The exhaustion he felt wasn't just from the long hours at the plant. It was the weariness of carrying that unspoken history, that private shame. He rarely spoke of it, not to Sarah, not to his closest friends at work. It was his burden alone, a silent penance he paid every day. The steady rhythm of the machine, the constant, predictable hum, was both a comfort and a cage. It was his penance and his salvation. The steady rhythm of the machine, the constant, predictable hum, was both a comfort and a cage. It was his penance and his salvation, until the day the hum went silent, at least in his head, replaced by a dull, insistent throb. He sat across from Mr. Henderson, a man whose office always smelled of stale coffee and even staler hope. This wasn't Earl's first time in a lawyer's office for money troubles, but it was the first time he felt like he was watching his own life play out on a faded screen, utterly powerless to change the ending. The fluorescent lights hummed above, mirroring the buzz of anxiety behind his eyeballs. Mr. Henderson, with his thinning hair and perpetually tired eyes, pushed a stack of papers across the desk. Not just a few bills, but a monument of them. A veritable skyscraper of his poor decisions, his impatience, his relentless pursuit of the next big score. Each sheet was a whisper of a promise broken, a gamble lost, a hope extinguished. "Earl," Mr. Henderson said, his voice flat, devoid of judgment, which somehow made it worse. "We've gone over every option, every single one. This is it. There's nothing left to reorganize, nothing left to delay. You're looking at Chapter 7. Earl just stared at the papers. He saw the names of the creditors, the amounts, the interest rates that had eaten him alive. But more than that, he saw Sarah's worried face, Emily's college fund, now a meager shadow of what it should have been, and Michael's quiet dreams of a better future. He saw the years of chasing phantom fortunes, the endless scrolling through online forums, the late nights spent convincing himself this was the one, the big breakthrough. He saw the arrogance, the ego, the certainty that he was smarter than the market, smarter than the slow, grinding work that built actual wealth. He told himself it was about providing for his family, about giving them more than he had. But looking at that stack, at the ruin it represented, he knew it wasn't about them. It was about him. His hunger for a quick win, his disdain for the steady climb, his foolish belief that shortcuts existed to anything truly worthwhile. The truth hit him like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of his chest. It wasn't some economic downturn, not bad luck, not a sudden unforeseen catastrophe. It was him, all him. His own two hands had dug this hole deeper than he'd ever imagined possible. He swallowed, a dry, bitter lump forming in his throat. That night's sleep was a cruel joke. He lay in bed next to Sarah, her breathing even and soft, a stark contrast to the earthquake rumbling through his own bones. At 3 a.m., the house was a tomb. He slipped out from under the covers, careful not to wake her, and padded into the kitchen. The faint glow of the digital clock on the microwave painted the room in an eerie green. He poured himself a glass of water, the clinking of the ice sounding like church bells in the oppressive silence. He sat at the kitchen table, the worn laminate cool under his palms. What had his life become? He asked himself the question not with anger or self-pity, but with a brutal, chilling honesty that stripped away every last defense. He was 48, a factory worker, starting from scratch. No, worse than scratch. He was starting from a debt-ridden pit, having dragged his family down with him. The modest house, the reliable car, the small savings for retirement, all gone or soon to be. The garden out back, his solitary joy, felt like a mockery. He'd nurtured those tomatoes, those peppers, watched them grow from tiny seeds to sturdy plants, all with patient, consistent effort. Yet he couldn't apply that same simple wisdom to his own life. He closed his eyes, the darkness behind his eyelids offering no escape. He saw the younger Earl, full of fire, convinced he was destined for more than the factory floor. Convinced he was destined to be rich. He hadn't hated hard work, not really. But he'd scoffed at slow work, at the idea that real wealth was built brick by painful brick, year after painstaking year. He'd seen the men who did that, the ones who bought bonds, saved a little, lived within their means, and he'd thought them fools, plodding along while he zipped past on the fast lane. Now those fools probably owned their homes free and clear. Their kids probably had actual college funds, and they slept soundly. He, the smart one, the ambitious one, was staring into the abyss of his own making. The shame was a suffocating blanket. The thought of telling Emily, who was working 2 part-time jobs to help with her community college tuition, that her dad had gambled away their security. The thought of Michael, still innocent, still believing his dad was strong and capable. How could he look them in the eye? He wasn't strong. He was a fool. A greedy, impatient fool who had nearly destroyed everything that mattered. The cold, stark reality of his utter failure pressed down on him until he felt like he couldn't breathe. This wasn't just a financial crisis. It was a crisis of identity, of dignity. He was a broken man, stripped bare, with nothing left to hide behind. The cold, stark reality of his utter failure pressed down on him until he felt like he couldn't breathe. This wasn't just a financial crisis. It was a crisis of identity, of dignity. He was a broken man, stripped bare, with nothing left to hide behind. Then somewhere in that desolate landscape of his own making, a tiny flicker, not hope, not yet, just a quiet, unyielding recognition. Enough. It wasn't angry. It wasn't desperate. It was just a profoundly tired acknowledgement that this path, the one he'd been on, was a dead end. He couldn't keep doing this. Couldn't keep chasing phantoms and leaving wreckage in his wake. The shame, the fear, the exhaustion, it had finally reached its saturation point. He had tried to outsmart the world, outrun the truth, and all he'd done was trip himself up again and again. He lay there, rigid, until the first hint of gray light seeped through the bedroom window. The world outside was waking up, unconcerned with Earl's personal apocalypse. A bird chirped, then another. The distant hum of the early morning delivery trucks began. Life went on, and for Earl it had to go on too, just not like this. He didn't have a grand plan, no sudden epiphany on how to solve everything. All he knew was that the old Earl, the impatient, greedy Earl, was dead. Or he had to be. The alarm clock blared at 5:00 a.m., sharp and unforgiving. His hand, heavy and reluctant, reached out to slap it silent. For years, that sound had signaled another day of drudgery, a day to get through until he could maybe, just maybe, catch that big break. Today it felt different. Today it was a call to arms. He swung his legs out of bed, the floor cold beneath his bare feet. Sarah was still asleep, her breathing soft and steady beside him. He looked at her, then at the empty space where Emily and Michael slept. They deserved better. He deserved better. But better wasn't going to materialize from chasing a lottery ticket or an internet scheme. Better was built. He made coffee, the familiar aroma a small comfort in the quiet kitchen. Usually he'd scroll through his phone looking for news, for anything that might hint at an opportunity he was missing. Today he left the phone on the counter. Instead, he pulled out a small, worn notebook he usually reserved for jotting down factory shift notes, and a pen. His hand hovered over the first blank page. What now? He thought about the lawyer, the bills, the overwhelming debt. His instinct screamed to find a solution, a fast solution. But the quiet, "Enough!" from the night before echoed in his head. Ain't no shortcut to anything worth having. You gotta plant the seed, water it, watch it grow. He remembered his father, a man who built their first small shed with his own hands, hammering every nail, painting every plank. It took weeks. Earl, impatient even then, had complained. "Why don't we just buy one, Pop?" His father had just smiled. "Son, what you build yourself, you understand from the ground up. You know its worth. You appreciate every damn screw." Earl closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, his first step. It had to be foundational, simple, something he could do. He opened the notebook. On the first page, he wrote in his deliberate, slightly cramped hand, monthly income, then below it, fixed expenses, mortgage, utilities, car insurance, phone bills, student loan, Emily's share. It was excruciating. Every number he wrote down was a punch to the gut. The money coming in, the money going out, the stark deficit staring back at him. His old self would have tossed the notebook aside in disgust, convinced it was pointless, convinced there had to be an easier way to make those numbers balance. But this morning, the new Earl just kept writing. He listed groceries, gas, medical copays, even the small allowance he gave Michael. No fudging the numbers, no optimistic estimates, just the raw, ugly truth. It took him 20 minutes, maybe more. When he was done, he sat back, staring at the page. It wasn't a solution. It was merely the first, hard, honest look at the ground he was standing on. His stomach clenched. The desire to just run away from it, to find a distraction, to look for that shiny, quick fix was powerful. It clawed at him, a familiar siren song promising escape. But he gripped the pen tighter. He drew a line under the totals. He hadn't dug himself out of the hole, not by a long shot. But for the first time in years, he had actually looked into it. He understood its depth. And understanding, he realized, was the very first seed you planted before you could even think about climbing out. It was heavy, daunting work, this honest accounting. His heart pounded with anxiety, but beneath it, a tiny, unfamiliar tremor of something else stirred. It felt like bedrock. He folded the notebook carefully, tucking it into his lunchbox. It wasn't much, but it was his first brick, laid carefully and honestly. The next few days were a quiet kind of war. Not with anyone else, but with the man in the mirror. Earl had always been a creature of habit, and those habits, he was slowly realizing, had mostly involved a subconscious reaching for comfort, for the easy way. Now, every decision felt like a negotiation. At the factory cafeteria, he passed on the soda and the candy bar, a ritual he'd enjoyed for years, a small reward for grinding through the morning shift. The carbonated sweetness, the chocolate melting on his tongue, they were tiny, harmless luxuries, or so he'd told himself. But the notebook tucked away in his lunchbox whispered a different truth. Each dollar, each nickel added up. He ate the apple Sarah had packed, crunchy and tart, and drank water from the fountain. It tasted flat. He felt a pinch of resentment, a childish, "Why me?" bubbling up. He swallowed it down with the water. By the end of that first week, the initial tremor of bedrock had given way to a dull ache. The novelty of honest accounting had faded faster than a cheap paint job. What was left was the unglamorous, relentless reality of saying no. No to the extra coffee on the way to work, no to the impulse buy at the grocery store, no to the flickering thought of hitting up the gas station for a lottery ticket. A foolish habit he'd clung to even through the worst times, a tiny, desperate hope for a shortcut. Every no felt like another small chip out of him, leaving him feeling smaller, deprived. Sarah noticed it. "You okay, or you're quieter than usual?" He'd just grunt or manage a strained, "Yeah, just tired." How could he explain that he was tired from fighting himself, from constantly rerouting the river of his own desires? Then came the end of the second week, and the ache had deepened into something heavy, like a persistent bruise. Michael, his boy, had mentioned a new video game, one all his friends were talking about. "It's on sale, Dad," he'd said, his eyes bright with that particular teenage intensity. Old Earl, the one who chased rainbows, would have seen it as a small investment in his son's happiness, brushed aside the cost. New Earl felt the tug, a familiar ache of wanting to provide, wanting to be the hero. But the numbers from his notebook flashed in his mind, stark and unforgiving. He'd taken Michael aside that evening after dinner while Sarah was helping Emily with college applications. "Son," he started, his voice rougher than he intended, "that game, it's a lot right now. We gotta be careful with money." Michael's face fell, the light dimming. "But Dad, everyone has it." Earl felt a familiar clench in his stomach, the old shame and guilt rising up. He wanted to make it better, to just say, "Yes, To go back to the days where he didn't have to think twice about 50 bucks for a video game, the temptation to just shrug it off to say, "What's 50 bucks in the grand scheme?" was enormous. It was a small thing, he told himself, not like the big, reckless investments he used to make. But that was the trap, wasn't it? The small things adding up, the slow bleed that eventually emptied the well. That's how he'd gotten into trouble before, the accumulation of just this once, and it's not that much. He closed his eyes for a beat, seeing not just Michael's disappointed face, but the stack of bankruptcy papers, the lawyer's tired gaze. "I know, son," he said, opening his eyes, meeting Michael's gaze head-on. "And I'm sorry, but we can't right now, not if we're gonna build something solid, something that lasts. That means making tough choices, even the small ones." He didn't try to soften the blow with promises of a future purchase. He just spoke the truth, raw and unvarnished. Michael nodded slowly, still disappointed, but there was a flicker of understanding in his eyes. Earl walked away from that conversation feeling like he'd just run a marathon. He hadn't bought the game. He hadn't failed his new resolve. But it had cost him. It had cost him a piece of easy happiness, a moment of being the generous dad. And he wondered, lying awake later that night, if this was what it would always feel like. This constant gnawing, this endless struggle against himself. Was this slow growth just a fancy name for perpetual deprivation? The thought was a bitter pill. He wanted to give up, just throw in the towel, and go back to chasing whatever shiny thing glittered on the horizon. It felt easier to fail big than to succeed slowly, painstakingly. Easier to just collapse than to keep pushing that rock uphill, day after day, for what felt like no visible progress. He almost did. One Saturday, he found himself pulling into the parking lot of the same convenience store where he used to buy his lottery tickets. His hand was on the door handle. Just one ticket, he reasoned. A small, harmless flutter of hope. Nobody would know. He could afford $1. The thought of that little piece of paper, that slim chance of escape, was intoxicating after 2 weeks of grinding self-denial. But then he saw his reflection in the tinted glass of the door, tired and drawn. He saw the faint lines of worry around his eyes, lines he'd tried to erase for years by chasing quick fixes. He remembered the feel of that cold plastic chair across from the bankruptcy lawyer. He looked at his hands on the steering wheel, hands that had built things, fixed things, but had also fumbled away futures. He took a deep breath, the stale air of the parking lot filling his lungs, and slowly, deliberately, he shifted the car into reverse. He drove home, no lottery ticket in his pocket, just the heavy, familiar weight of his resolve. The fight was far from over, but he hadn't lost this round. Not yet. The drive home was quiet, save for the hum of the old pickup. No lottery ticket, no fleeting hope, no dizzying dreams. Just the stark reality of the road ahead, familiar and unyielding. Earl felt a strange emptiness, but beneath it, a tiny seed of something else had taken root. A quiet pride in the fight he'd won. That night, he slept deeper than he had in weeks, a fragile peace settling over him. The next few days didn't bring any sudden epiphanies or grand pronouncements. It was just more of the same. The 5 a.m. alarm, the clang of the factory, the endless grind. But something had shifted inside Earl. The resentment that had simmered for so long, the feeling that he was too good for this, too smart for this, began to recede. He started to look at his work not as a temporary holding pattern until his next big score, but as a deliberate act, a choice. He focused on the rhythm of the machine, the precision of his movements, the solid, tangible product that rolled off the line. He learned the names of a few more guys on his shift, offered a quiet nod, a brief, genuine smile. Sarah noticed it first. One evening, as he was meticulously weeding the small vegetable patch in the backyard, something he'd only ever done out of obligation before, she brought him a glass of iced tea. "You look different, Earl," she said, her voice soft. He straightened up, wiping a streak of dirt from his brow. "Just tired, I guess," he mumbled, but there was a faint, contented hum beneath his words. She watched him for a moment, then smiled, a real smile, one that reached her eyes. "No," she corrected gently, "not tired, peaceful." He didn't answer, just turned back to the soil, a small smile of his own playing on his lips. She wasn't wrong. The simple act of tending to something, watching the tiny green shoots push through the earth, felt like a balm to his restless soul. It was slow, agonizingly slow, but it was real. Weeks melted into months. The heavy shadow of the bankruptcy, though still a formidable presence, no longer completely eclipsed their lives. Earl's new discipline permeated their home. He'd bring home his paycheck, look Sarah in the eye, and together they'd meticulously go through the bills. No more hiding statements, no more furtive phone calls. The process was slow, sometimes disheartening, but it was transparent. It was theirs. Emily, home from community college for the summer, found him one afternoon poring over a ledger, not a stock market ticker. "Dad," she asked, "what are you doing?" He looked up, a faint smudge of ink on his cheek. "Just figuring things out, Em," he said. "Seeing what we got where it needs to go. Making sure we're building on solid ground." It wasn't the excited talk of future millions he'd once shared, but Emily saw the steady, reassuring light in his eyes. At work, a younger guy, fresh out of trade school, came up to him on break, full of bluster about a new crypto coin that was gonna moon. Earl listened, nodding slowly as the young man talked about getting rich quick. When the kid finally ran out of breath, Earl took a slow sip of his lukewarm coffee. "Son," he said, his voice raspy from years of factory air, "you ever planted a tree?" The kid looked confused. "Like in the ground?" Earl nodded. "Takes a while for it to grow, don't it? You gotta water it, prune it, protect it from the weather. But once it's grown, it stands. It provides shade. It lasts. Folks get impatient, want a full-grown oak overnight. They try to plant it in thin air or just sprinkle some magic dust on a sapling. Don't work that way." Never does. He didn't preach, didn't condemn, just offered a quiet observation born of hard-won experience. The young man scratched his head, then mumbled, "Yeah, I guess." Michael, his youngest, started coming out to the garden with him sometimes. At first, it was just to mess around, but then he started asking questions. "Why do you put those stakes there, Dad?" Or, "How long does it take for a tomato to grow?" Earl patiently explained the cycles, the needs of the plants, the unwavering consistency required. He saw the world differently now. The small daily contributions, the steady hand, the unwavering commitment, these were not the dull chains of his past, but the sturdy foundations of his future. The lines around his eyes were still there, etched by years of worry, but now they were softened, framed by a quiet peace. He still looked like a man who'd seen a lot, but now he looked like a man who understood it. One warm evening, sitting on the porch swing with Sarah, watching the fireflies blink in the dusk, he finally articulated the lesson that had cost him so much. "You know, Sarah," he began, his voice low, "I spent so many years chasing rainbows. Always thought there was a shortcut, a faster way to get what we deserved. Thought hard work was for suckers when there were fortunes to be made in a blink." He paused, looking out at the silhouette of his thriving garden. "Ain't no shortcut to anything worth having. You gotta plant the seed, water it, watch it grow. Takes time. Lot of folks want a big tree tomorrow, but they ain't willing to dig the hole today. I learned that the hard way, lost everything chasing rainbows." He turned to her, his gaze steady. "Now, I just focus on putting one foot in front of the other, steady as she goes. That's real rich, knowing you built it honest, piece by piece." And in the quiet hum of the evening, in the solid ground beneath their feet,